I can't call myself an atheist anymore. I think I'm just your standard agnostic. There are days where I think there could be something. It would be nice if there's something. I see elements of strength in people that are hard to explain the origin of, but then at the same time, I also have days where I see what I see in the world, and that's all I think there might be. I will say, and this is. I don't know, this feels controversial to my kind of progressive bent on the world. But I definitely now have a understanding that evil exists in this world that I did not have back when I was an idealistic religious kid. I've just seen the torment that other people have put others through, and there's no other word for it. Now, whether that has a metaphysical origin, I don't know, but there's a lot of darkness in this world, and I think the only curative for it is the audacity of people who reside in the truth and insist upon it. And I'm just very lucky to spend some time with folks like that.
So let me introduce you. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. I am Frank Schaeffer, and my guest today has written a book that I just finished reading. I have a lot of quotes I'm going to talk about. Sarah, now say your name one more time.
Stankorb.
Stankorb, that's it. Okay, yes. Sarah Stankorb is a journalist whose articles and essays have appeared in all sorts of places, from the New York Times to the Washington Post, Vogue, O Magazine, etc. She's the author of the national bestseller, Disobedient Women, How a Small Group of Faithful Women Exposed Abuse and Brought Down Powerful Pastors and Ignited an Evangelical Reckoning. And Sarah, you were brought to my attention in terms of a question that I always ask my guests that I will ask you later. A little while ago, I interviewed Krista Brown, whose book, Baptist Land, I annotated carefully and read. And you describe her in your book as a, quote, watchful introvert by nature, is a steadying force. And so the first thing I wanted to do is just thank Krista for telling us, when are you going to interview Sarah? And here we are. So, Krista talked to me and got me on board with this, and I'm very glad. Unlike Krista's book that I have here that I read in paperback, I read yours on Kindle. The advantage is that I can copy and paste to a file and ask you about things. The disadvantage is I can't do what I did with Krista when I interviewed her and hold her book up and show her how dog-eared it is and prove that I actually read it. But I did read yours with the same attention, and we'll talk about it. So first of all, I don't know whether you mentioned this or not, but in your book, you talk about the fact that you've got a kind of a voice thing that you call dysphonia, which, I don't know whether you like to mention that. So if people wonder what's going on, and I forget what page it's on, but you say, if my voice cracks due to my dysphonia, and so forth and so on, don't be awkward about it. And that you've met a few people who are careful listeners. So I just thought I would mention that. I don't know if that makes you more or less comfortable, but I would.
Oh, it's fine.
So that people realize, that you have a voice thing, and I'll listen carefully. So first of all, let me say that when I read your book, it's an odd experience for me because every single bad person you mention in the book is someone more or less without exception that I knew personally, whether it's Gothard or Focus on the Family and all those people, having been very active in the evangelical world in the 70s and the 80s, and then I fled the evangelical world. The anatomy of your book is built around women's stories exposing what happened to them in the very big time ministries like Bill Gothard's that I knew of personally. He visited us in Switzerland a couple of times. I remember being on the road in our seminars and he coming backstage to talk to my dad. So it was a tough read for me because in a way I know too much about what you're talking about and knew these people. And then reading the women's stories in terms of the abuse they suffered at their hands. And of course, Krista's stories about the Southern Baptists and so forth is very personal in the sense that I was part of that world as a nepotistic sidekick to my father, Francis Schaeffer, who was in and amongst these guys, fortunately not one of the abusers of of young women and so forth that like Bill Gothard was. But nevertheless, this is a world, if I can put it in a weird way, I know your subject too well. So I'll just
Mhm.
start with that. I don't know where you want to go with that, and then we'll get into the book itself.
Um, I mean, that's actually not an uncommon response. I'm hearing from a lot of readers who grew up in this world. Maybe their family was the ATI, the
Yeah,
Advanced Training Institute, a Bill Gothard family, and they were not directly affected by Bill Gothard, but the curriculum, the worldview did
yeah,
impact them. And seeing mirrored something that you lived and
yeah,
so intimately, it's very unsettling and
yeah,
strange. So I'm sorry
yeah,
that you had
yeah.
that experience.
Well, I enjoyed the book as a book. That's not to take away from it at
Mhm.
all, but it's just an odd connection. Let me
Yeah.
start by reading a quote from your book. Let me see where this is from. I think it's, I don't know what page it is, but anyway, I think this is a good open. In 2016, many evangelical leaders who had taught young girls they were tempting boys into sin with front hugs or premarital kissing appeared to develop politically motivated moral amnesia. With the promise of a president who would nominate Supreme Court justices to help overturn Roe v. Wade and other major cultural war precedents, major evangelical leaders fell in line with the thrice married socialite Donald Trump. And then, of course, there's a lot more to that story. But I thought I would start there because
Hmm.
you wrote your book, what, a couple of years ago? It was published a year ago. Um, isn't it crazy that here we are again?
Yeah.
And so fast forward to a white evangelical vote, and by the way, a Hispanic charismatic Christian vote as well,
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
which nobody wants to talk about on the liberal side of things because there's a lot of brown and black people now on religion, for religious reasons, also part of that
Yes.
cult.
Yes.
But here we are again. So I want to get into your book, but let's just fast forward, first of all, to the fact that this seems like we're just stuck in concrete or something. We can't get out of this. And of course, it's the religious backing he has that keeps Trump current. That's the basis of his
Hmm.
cult. I know you have thoughts on this. You touch on it in your book, but why don't we go to that first and then get into the anatomy of the book?
Yeah. So in 2016, and I actually reported on this in real time, I was interviewing women who were white, evangelical, predominantly not only white women, but many white women who were part of the evangelical world,
Yeah.
who starting with Trump and then certainly through Me Too,
Mm,
were horrified by these new alignments with their church, and many of them left. So a few went to mainstream churches,
mm,
but you did see an exodus from evangelicalism in general. And I think a lot of that was this multiple generations, especially women raised in purity culture, had this mindset that they had to protect their bodies. If anything happened to them, if they were assaulted, if anything unwanted happened to their body, it was their fault for tempting
yeah.
a man into that. And to have had such esteem for these leaders who had such authority over their lives, and to see them swinging completely the other way and offer all sorts of forgiveness or just look the other way with a figure like Donald Trump, it was shattering
Mm,
to a lot of people's faith. Now, as white evangelicals, some left their churches, you're absolutely right. We're seeing now with like the New Apostolic Reformation. I saw you interview Matthew Taylor. There's this swell of a different vein of evangelicalism, and I think part of it's newer. It's driven by prophets and maybe more metaphysical claims.
yeah.
So you don't have as many people who are like born into it, given this dogma that is just the only thing you must believe, you must live by it. And so I think the cognitive dissonance isn't exactly the same, maybe just due to a factor of time. But yes, in many ways, we're back in the same place, but I think some of the ground players are different. We've seen at the grassroots a shift.
Mm,
We're also seeing plenty of women who, from any Christian stripe are leaving the church.
yeah,
Gen Z is the first generation where we see more women than men abandoning the church. So there's a lot happening.
yeah,
But I get what you're saying. It feels like a rerun. It's
yes.
the train we're watching, and people don't really know how to stop it.
Mm. You know, you point out in your book that the women leave have always been a more dominant force in churches. Not that they were allowed to speak, but in numbers, you know, it's
Mhm.
always the mother bringing someone to a baptism or something. And you
Yes.
point out, and you use the phrase that the women pushing back and leaving was sort of the canary in the coal mine, because if the women start quitting, we're
Mhm.
we're done. That's not what I was going to go to next, but anyway, yeah, I read that with great interest. Let me read a quote from your book that I do want to get into here
Okay.
as part of the setup of our discussion. You write, and forgive me if I read this at some length, but it's really
But
it's kind of what should be on the cover of your book. It like it's what you're writing about, I think. When girls are taught, quote, biblical womanhood equates with purity and submission, they are trained to feel responsible for protecting men from their allegedly God ordained sexual appetites, dress
mhm.
modestly, avoid front to front hugs, vow virginity until marriage, but also obliged to yield to authority figures, their pastors, fathers, men. Through one lens, they are delicate, precious, but through another, easy prey. Once preyed upon, blame often boomerangs back to the woman or girl. She lured in the hungry predator, Jezebel, tool of Satan. That's how the trap snaps shut. Isolates these victims of abuse within the church. There's no opportunity to learn that they were being groomed by a far more experienced man in a position of power. Laws are on the books in about a dozen states that bar sexual contact between clergy and congregants, whatever their age, but she doesn't know, isn't told. And I really
Mhm.
think that's a brilliant summation. And also, by the way, if I may say so, just writer to writer, um, beautiful piece of writing. What a paragraph.
Mhm. Thank you.
Really, really wonderful piece of writing, but also just sums it all up, doesn't it?
Yeah. So I've had the experience over years now interviewing women who were once girls raised in these environments, and some are survivors of spiritual abuse. Others, I'd say at this point, the majority sexual abuse of some sort.
Yeah.
And it has given me this portrait of authority and spiritual authority, and how much people can trust that a human being, a man on
Mm,
our earth within these communities, a man, um, can have access to what God wants, what God wills. And that's such an enormous power. And then if you contrast that with being a child, and
mm,
in particular a little girl, so many of these women that I interviewed began being deeply invested in their faith.
mm,
They wanted to be good for God. So they have access to this religious figure who seems to have the answers.
mm.
So if you want those answers, this is who you turn to.
Yeah.
And then when that person exploits you, or that person tells you it's God's will that they can Chris's in Chris's story that they were essentially married in God's eyes, who are you to question?
Mm,
And it's this net that closes around these girls.
yeah.
At the same time, because they have such vulnerability, if the story does become public, in almost every case, the pastor is restored or moved or given a
Mm,
slap on the wrist. Um, but someone has to bear the consequences, and it usually is blamed on the young woman. Surely this high spiritual figure could not have been tempted into such evil doing
mm,
if not for her. And it's this funny view of power because these girls have so little power except with their bodies, except with the perceived view of what they must have done with their body
Mm,
to ensnare someone in such evil. And it's so murky and difficult for
mm.
the survivors to pull all that apart and really see what happened to them.
Yeah, I'm talking with Sarah Stankorb, and her book is Disobedient Women: How a Small Group of Faithful Women Exposed Abuse, Brought Down Powerful Pastors, and Ignited an Evangelical Reckoning. And I mentioned the person who said that we should be interviewing you was Krista Brown, who is one of your interviewees in your book. So before I go to the next quote, let's just talk about how you wrote this book. And I mean, literally how you interviewed women. You wrote it down and then you added your own comments. So two questions. First of all, how did this come about? Were you writing articles on the subject and then you thought, okay, there's a book? And then secondly, what was the process of interviewing? Did you do this in person, over the phone? Just talk about the book.
Sure. So I think that I want to say the first story I wrote that's relevant to this book was probably in 2015.
Yeah.
So I kind of became part of this very narrow band in the religion beat for reporters. Um, and then likely somewhere around 2000, there started to be newer podcasts kind of interrogating what happened with a few of these big name pastors. And it frankly started to really irritate me that the podcasters would
Mm.
talk to, you know, the former assistant pastor and the women who put their lives on the line.
Yeah.
Often these things come with threats to expose them, or the women that were diligently writing about all of this online for years.
Yeah.
Um, and I had a conversation. It was my 40th birthday. It was a Zoom birthday party
Mm.
because we were in the middle of the pandemic. And a friend said, "Are you ever going to write a book?" And I said, "Yeah, I want to." And she
Yeah.
said, what do you care about most? And I said, "These women, they're incredible and their stories are so compelling." So
Mm.
that was the idea. Um, so given the years and years I have known these people in the book, some of them I have text message threads going back, 6, 7, 8 years. We talk over the phone off and on, checking in, seeing if there's a resolution or a new part of their story. Um, when the book, if ads came, I spent it traveling around to go see some of them in person that I hadn't before.
Yeah.
So parts of it are just sitting with people. And I'll say in covering stories of such horrible abuse, and in many cases, it's very long lasting. It
Yeah.
takes an incredible amount of time. People with PTSD do not always tell stories in chronological order. They come piecemeal. So it's my job to absorb all of it, go back, write up my timeline, say,
Yeah.
this is what I understand the events occurred in. I'm so sorry to make you have to relive it by reading it.
Mm.
But here's what I have. Is this accurate? And I will say that survivors of abuse who've gone through the toll of coming forward are
Yeah.
so committed to the accuracy of their stories to the best of their ability. They will provide me with any backup I need to corroborate what I've been told or what else I've
Hmm.
gathered. Because so often, as soon as you make an allegation, she's lying, she's not telling the truth, or he's lying, he's not telling the truth. So a big part of it's just the organization of these massive conversations and then making sure everything lines up.
Yeah, one comment you have in your book that sort of sets it up again is: together my sources' influences could read like a Venn diagram displaying overlaps between evangelical Christianity, patriarchy, nationalism, racism, and a church celebrity culture that elevates all brands of false authority. I aim to show how these themes hummed as background noise of the theology that shaped their lives in the flux between abuse of power, physical and spiritual and sexual abuse and spiritual torment. And one thing I found interesting in the book was that some of the women you interviewed wanted to remain anonymous because they still had a sense of threat.
Yes.
Another point you made, and I'll pause to have you address both because I found them interesting. One, the anonymity that some people needed, not just for embarrassment, but they still felt threatened. And then second, I often disparage the internet, which I use. We're using it right now, but you point out that before the advent of, online media, that there was almost nowhere anybody with a story like this could go. They were stuck until blogs began to emerge. You go into the blogging, and then of course now we have posts online and all the rest of it. So just tell about those two things: the need for anonymity on one hand, and yet the courage of women who come out and post and say, "Look, this was done to me," whether it was 20 years ago or 20 minutes ago. And then juxtaposed with what Krista Brown talks about in terms of people like the Southern Baptist Convention still refusing to deal with this, even though it's now more out in the open. Everybody knows what they did because people have spoken out. There's a lot of questions there. If you just want to riff on that, I'm sorry to be so confused.
I take notes. So, in terms of anonymity, it's the hell people have been through and witnessing other survivors go through that. I completely understand. And frankly, I do not push people to go on record with their name. To me, it's unethical. And to journalists, it's unethical for something like sexual assault. Only really if someone insists, I need my name attached to this, this is part of my healing process, or if they have been public previously, then I'm comfortable using a name. Many cases, they have children, some share custody with their abuser, and the threat of their child getting the blowback from them being honest is petrifying. And so that's just I'm not going to endanger someone's children for a story. Before the internet. So there's this phrase that gets bandied around now, women talking, and in evangelicalism and other religious communities, this warning about gossip, the sin of gossip. And there is a danger of people talking sometimes because they tell the truth, not because they're concocting a range of lies. So in religious communities, I think there always has been, a warning, or in work environments, anywhere where women are, and there's someone who poses a danger, you might see, just don't make sure you're not alone with that person. However, with the internet, I think the power of it was not only there was a platform to tell your own story, but the bigger piece is that once one story was told, people who thought, well, I'm the only person who's ever had this experience.
Sure.
It's easier when it's only you to believe it was your fault. But once you see someone else has had this experience and then another, and you realize, what, this teaching about gender, this teaching about sexuality was also part of what legitimized what happened, then you start to be able to pick it apart. And to me, that's why the internet has been so powerful and so freeing. And as for the SBC, I mean, there are plenty of entities. I have a few chapters on Sovereign Grace Ministries, which is now Sovereign Grace Church.
Yeah.
They changed their name. You can rebrand and just move on unless you have a real consequence, like the Southern Baptist Convention, which at least there's the Department of Justice investigation. However, if you followed the most recent annual meeting, there was like the tiniest bit of lip service about abuse. but they've already moved on and they're beginning a fight over the personhood of embryos in vitro fertilization.
Mhm.
Forget the personhood of the many, many people who have been abused within these churches. It's a deflection, but it's also one that will have political consequences. So talk about retreading the same land over and over for sure. That I left that meeting with that feeling that it's just happening all over again.
Yeah, we're talking with Sarah Stankorb about her book, and it's a really good book. I just want to interject one thing. I'd like to get your permission to include it in my book club. I have a book club called It Has to Be Read that we do online as part of my commentary. It has to be said, and then of course that fits in with our podcast that we're doing here. And I would like to add it to my book club. I don't know what in September, if that's okay.
Sure, absolutely. The
And
paperback is out in August, so it'll
oh,
be
good,
cheaper.
good timing. Okay, well, we'll be selling the paperback. Please subscribe to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer at Apple Podcasts, and also to my Substack. It has to be said at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And we also promote our book club. It has to be read in the same place. So we are talking about a book that I have a lot of notes on, and I'm going to just dive in to one of them here because I would like to read this and see what you think. But over subsequent years, Vicky read transformative books such as Be Fruitful and Multiply. So what we're talking about here is this, quiverful movement where all of a sudden, you're not only, motherhood is not only being pitched to women, but you've got to have a lot of kids and they've got to all be submitting to the father, as does the wife. Spanking is involved. It morphs into the whole homeschool movement, Mary Pride and all the rest. And by the way, when Mary Pride was getting going, I was her book agent that sold her first books
Oh,
to Crossway Books. I interviewed
really?
her. Yes, yes. So I have a whole file of stuff from Mary. She was totally unknown and she was a fan of my father and wrote. And I wrote back to her after I read her letters. This was in, I forget what year, let's call it 79, 78, maybe 80, 81. And I put her in touch with Crossway Books and basically agented her first book for her, because at that time I was representing my parents as well as C. Everett Koop and about 20 other authors, because I had represented my parents' books as the producer of their films, How Should We Then Live and Whatever Happened to the Human Race, etc. But anyway, small footnote, Mary's books, The Way Home, I probably went through that manuscript half a dozen times that she would send me pitches for, then presented it to Crossway. She dedicated one of her books to me. And then in later editions, after I left the faith and ran off in a different direction, I was taken off the dedication page and so forth and so on. So I don't know why I'm telling you that, but you've
That's
got a lot about
amazing.
Mary Pride.
Yeah. Wow. Oh, that's incredible.
Yeah. And what was funny, I'll tell you one more crazy thing. My mother wrote a book. My mother was very favorable about sexuality and women's pleasure. And Mary Pride broke with my mom over that and said, sex is not for pleasure, it's for making children. Why have you got all that stuff about wearing nice lingerie for your husband? And then she sort of went off more and more at a tangent. That's nothing to do with your book in particular, but I thought that I would give you a little amusement on the way through here.
Oh, that's incredible. I'm so thrilled to know this.
Yeah. So
Oh,
Mary's secret, by the way, was that her husband was a tech aficionado when the internet was just starting,
uh, uh,
and he really knew how to handle it. So when people began to have personal computers, long before Apple or anybody was doing anything, he was in there. He was a real visionary, sort of an unsung Elon
oh,
Musk type of guy. I mean, genuinely. And then they were having all these babies. And so when she started her homeschool thing, the reason it took off the way it did was that she and her husband, whose name I forget, understood the potential of the internet more than anybody. This is pre-personal phones, way more than anybody else. And she built this whole thing. And then she started producing these workbooks to go with The Way Home. And it became an industry. And then after a little while, at Crossway Books, the Schaeffers were selling well. and the Left Behind thing was going well. And then all of a sudden it became all about Mary Pride and homeschool, and then that became an industry. So it became a big thing. Anyway, sorry. I just figured you'd be interested in that.
Oh, I absolutely. Oh,
Hey, I'm going to go to another passage of the book that I want to read to you here.
okay.
You talk about the way home beyond feminism back to reality. Mary Pride's thesis that women's essential role at home and for health of Christian country was to make themselves open to as many children as God would grant, quote unquote. Mary Pride wrote in The Way Home, quote, if each Christian family had 6 children and the humanists, feminists, and others kept on having an average of 1, then in 20 years, there would be 60 of us for every 40 of them. And in 40 years, 90% of America would be Christian. And that's from your book, I think, on page 80 or so. And it's interesting that you picked that kind of demographic threat out, because, of course, now, a couple of weeks ago, we just interviewed Brad Wilcox's book, Get Married, where he has all the statistics on the 1.7 children falling below replacement levels. So what's interesting to me is Mary Pride totally understood, for instance, what's happened on the West Bank in Israel, where the Orthodox Jews are having 4-to-1 numbers of children compared to the, quote, secular Jews. And we're watching Israel become a very far right country, where before it was dominated by much more secular forces. And here in America, we're in the same thing. You know, everybody, you know, one cohort is freezing their eggs and waiting till they're 40 to have a baby. And I'm being facetious, but you've got the kind of a remainder of the Quiverful movement combined with what you'd call the Mary Pride type family, irrespective of patriarchy, hierarchy, and all these other things. It's just weird that you've picked out something. I mean, weird in a good way, because you're very aware of stuff. I mean, this question of demography is one that, you know, Elon Musk is talking about.
Yes.
And Mary Pride got there first. And then here you are quoting her. I'm not going anywhere, except this is just fascinating stuff. And you're, you know, have at it. Talk about it.
Okay. So, I mean, honestly, I got into reporting on Quiverful through Vicky Garrison, whose name you started with at the beginning here.
Yeah.
And she was a woman who had left the movement, and she had had baby after baby after baby, and it completely depleted her body. Lots of health risks went into having these subsequent children. But it was kind of fed to her through homeschool conferences, which a lot of this information gets into the hands of women who, again, want to do what God wants through the homeschool movement. So there's where you get, you know, Mary Pride's guide to homeschooling, and then you also get this propaganda about replacement theory and how Christians have to outpopulate other religions. My theory on it is innately tied to these models of submissive womanhood. And when you give a man authority within these communities over their spiritual life of their family, the woman also needs a purpose. Well, the woman has a holy purpose. She carries around a womb, and she can produce the next generation. She's creating the army for God. So it gives you more than you can ever possibly hope to do in a day when you have 5, 6, 7 children, and you're feeding them and clothing them and doing the laundry, on and on and on, and educating them. And from a distance, it looks like truly she's accomplishing a lot in most cases. What I've been told by these mothers later is I could not educate that many children. I was pregnant all the time. I was sick. But at a distance, it's this holy activity for the women to participate in. It also harkens to a Victorian era purpose for women. this was part of like industrialization, men going off to work, and in these families, the men are the breadwinners,
Yeah.
and then the woman is the angel of the home, and the woman is there to model Christian life for the children. So these echoes, which make sense when you're in basically a fundamentalist community.
Hmm.
Um, you mentioned spanking and discipline, and that's part of the submissive
Sure.
model, not always the spanking, but sometimes other forms of abuse. But just as you may see in a church with a faith leader who has absolute authority, in a home where the father is that spiritual leader and has that absolute sense of I am heading the family,
Hmm.
that it can also morph into abusive behaviors.
Hmm.
Um, so, and that's something that from the kids, and I think this gets kind of glided past a lot when I talk about the book. So maybe I didn't do a good enough job highlighting it, but it's not all sexual abuse. In many of these homes, it's domestic abuse and educational neglect. But really, what they faced as a form of discipline
Hmm.
was being beaten into submission
Yeah.
regularly. And that is a whole lot to carry. And for the girls, the only escape is marriage to another spiritually authoritative man to get out of it. It's a really tangled place to
Yeah.
be, and it's certainly not in the past. If you're online, you and especially on Instagram, you've probably seen the trad wife movement, which is again a beautiful veneer of how lovely this all can be, how great it is to be taken care of. Um, we'll see. We'll see how that ends. Um, it's not all as glossy as it
Yeah.
looks ready for the internet.
Well, one of the people you talk about is Dr. Dobson, who had a story in his book, Dare to Discipline, about how he beat his dog
Yeah.
with his wife's rubber girdle as an illustration of how effective it was to beat a dog into submission, and then advocated, look, this works with kids too. So sort of an ultra violent undercurrent there. And another person you talk about a lot is Bill Gothard. You introduced something this way. It took some time for me to grasp that the popular umbrella of protection metaphor, which I'm going to ask you to explain, had been created by Pastor Bill Gothard, and for decades was treated as the logical outgrowth of scripture by many. So let's talk about Bill Gothard here. Again, I knew him personally. He used to visit us sometimes at my parents' mission in Switzerland. And then I visited him once, and I remember him standing backstage with us at a seminar in Dallas where he'd come to meet my dad. And my dad turning to me, and I've mentioned this before, and just saying, Bill Gothard is really weird. I do not trust him. There is something wrong with that man. And Bill had wanted to be
Wow.
introduced on stage by my dad. And dad said, I will never appear on a platform with him. And this is before
Really?
any of that other stuff was coming out. And there
Uh,
were many evangelicals, by the way, I just want to mention this, to whom Bill Gothard was true anathema. So if you talk to, for instance, the editorial board of Christianity Today magazine, or Billy Graham, who I knew and my dad was with, Billy and my dad despised Gothard and would have nothing to do with him because they sensed there was something really wrong. That doesn't mean they were in the right on your issues of
mhm.
this, but they were not, just to put not too fine a point on it, my father and Billy Graham and the people running Christianity Today magazine and Wheaton College were a lot of things, but they were not perverts.
Mm,
And Bill
mm,
Gothard was a nice little pervert. He was a snaky little son of a bitch.
mm,
So, I'm a father and I'm a grandfather of daughters and granddaughters. I would have done anything in my power if I, had had any reason to have them exposed to him or any of his acolytes. These were nasty people. They were the kind of people that, fathers and grandfathers don't want any of the women in their family to have anything to do with. And then you detail everything by interviewing the women that he's playing footsie with under the table and doing all sorts of stuff and who God knows what, combined with him advocating discipline of children.
mhm.
Of everybody in your book, and I cut to the chase here, of anybody I knew, Mary Pride, all these different people, I would say not only was Bill Gothard one of the snakiest people I've ever met, but maybe with the exception of Donald Trump, really someone who only was able to do what he did because he turned what he was doing into a cult where he had people really under his thumb in a way that nobody else did that I ever met. So anyway, that's
It's
just real personal
interesting.
stuff. Yeah.
That's really
Piece of shit,
interesting.
real piece of shit.
That's I'm not allowed to say that, but I think a lot of people would agree with you.
Yeah, and so I would just say, talk about some of the women he interviewed and what this piece of shit did, because he was a nasty piece of work and has still not been sufficiently discredited. The guy should have wound up
Oh,
in jail somewhere.
yeah. Do you want me to start with the umbrella of protection
Go
or
right
just
ahead.
jump in?
Talk about it.
So
Introduce this.
it's this idea that was very prevalent, and not only in Gothard's influence. I talked to people who were like, just a non-denominational or Baptist. They just thought this is something my church gave me.
Yeah,
But it's this goofy little image that shows Satan's threat kind of on the outside raining down. And in the
yeah,
middle is a large umbrella. And if you're under that large umbrella, that's Christ, which that would be maybe a normal metaphor. However, in his world where umbrellas work, like I've never seen umbrellas work, you need a smaller umbrella underneath that. That might be your pastor. And yet
yeah,
a tighter one still is the father in the family. Underneath that is the mother, and underneath there are the children. So it's this idea that if you stray outside of the protection of your father or your pastor, you get endangered by being too close to the threat of Satan.
yeah,
So really it's a picture about protection, but it's also about authority. If you do
yeah,
not respect the authority of the person in the hierarchy above you, you're inviting Satan into your life. And
yeah.
for a lot of people, that became gospel. Now, the issue with Gothard is manyfold, and it's hard if you're not part of this world. And I've had a lot of people explain to him over the years to
Oh, and
really
by the way,
grasp.
you point out, you have a quote in your book, and then I'll let you continue.
Yeah,
Gothard had ties to a bevy of political figures, Mike Huckabee,
yes,
Sarah Palin, former governor Sonny Perdue. Just saying, this isn't some obscure guy that didn't know anybody. Sorry, I
yeah.
interrupted,
No,
but it needs to
no,
be said.
millions of people attended his conferences. Their children used his curriculum to teach the children at home. So for many people, this man was like this godlike figure. People
Yeah,
described him as the evangelical pope, and he had all these political ties on a national level, but also to local
yeah,
um, governmental officials. So it's like this, if you're not part of it, a hidden web people didn't know existed.
yeah,
Within that world, though, people would go to these conferences and just feel so blessed to be near him and approved by him. Gothard created an encyclopedia of rules that were loosely related to scripture, but mostly his opinions on how you should dress, how you should structure your family, how you should make your money, every little increment of life. So in a way, it's almost like a self-help guru that
mhm,
people bought into very deeply because they believed it was what Christ wanted for their lives.
yeah,
So, and then in this world, people who would pay gobs of money to go to his conferences and learn from him, when he would notice their children out in the audience
yeah,
and invite them to headquarters or to one of his many training centers all over the world,
yeah,
it was an honor. It was as if God was giving you a blessing for someone like Gothard to see the goodness in your child.
yeah,
Very frequently, the girls that he selected matched with the look that he published in his books as to what a good Christian girl should do, how
yeah,
she should wear her hair, how she should wear her clothes. And it struck me that if someone were grooming for abuse, to be
sure.
able to produce a handbook of exactly what you like would
Mhm,
then certainly result in that coming right before you. And then these girls and boys, but the girls were the ones who primarily reported abuse at the training centers. Trusted him. They felt like he was they were blessed to be there. They weren't if they were under 16, they worked 40 plus hours a week for no pay. Um, and if he took a special liking to them, he would make a point of inviting them to sit with him in the
Yeah.
dining hall, which was an honor, or inviting them to his office. And
Yeah.
in his office, it was this incremental grooming process where perhaps he'd pray with them and hold their hands, maybe get a little bit closer, maybe pray with his legs splayed, which a number of people told me when he did that, they would see he had an erection. Many of them were too innocent to really understand what it was. They thought he had a medical condition. And he would encroach closer. He
Yeah.
often had his shoes off. He'd rub his soft feet up and down their legs. One of the women who did use a pseudonym for the book because she had not come forward previously was his personal secretary as a teenager. And he would spend a lot of time alone in his office. She described being in his back closet, him rubbing his lips all over her face. And all of this in a setting where if you reported it or if you even questioned it, you'd get sent home and everyone there would be told that you had done something wrong. And so none of those other young
Yeah, it
people
was
would
always your
want to
fault. I
contact
mean,
you. Yeah.
shades of, fake news. Fast
Uh,
forward to Donald Trump, and the 89 women who have credibly accused him, hey, they're all part of the deep state. I mean, it was no wonder the evangelicals understand how Trump operates because they allowed their pastors and people to do this. Gothard, unfortunately, is not unusual, um, in that sense. I just want to go to something personal here. You talk about publishing online can feel like offering a piece of oneself to the world. And just talk about that.
oh, so, I mean, that little bit was actually about me and learning how to blog and writing personal essays and disclosing like little bits about my life. And you really do open yourself up for judgment no matter what you're writing. But in the case of people making very personal disclosures about abuse, there's a whiplash of questioning, of doubt, of doxing, of threats,
Yeah.
depending upon the level of the allegation and the prominence of the person
Talk a,
talking about. It's
yeah, go ahead.
almost immediate, and it gets worse. Yeah, and it gets worse over time.
Talk a little bit about your own experiences on a personal level in terms of you came into the evangelical faith, unlike me, that was sort of groomed and raised from my mother's knee. You have this kind of a different story, and then you left it. And I just wondered what that trajectory was, how you've been treated personally. I know some of it's in the book and some of it may not be. I don't know
Mhm.
how much you want to share. As a woman who's been in religious circles, and now you're interviewing these other women. Okay, you're telling
Mhm.
their stories. Just tell us a little more about your own story.
Sure. So I was probably in some ways like these women. I was really, really into faith. I ended up in a Methodist youth group mostly because my mom could not afford therapy, and she thought these are trustworthy, and also for the most part, they were. But my best friend kind of fell into an evangelical church, and we started to also go to a Bible study there. At a certain point, he felt like his own father, who is the minister of our church, was not Christian enough, and we really needed to be at this other church. And I was introduced to this outlook on scripture that I hadn't had before. I had kind of had a very open-minded view of faith. I was really curious about lots of different faiths, though I saw myself as a Christian. And then it became so restrictive. But I had this in my mind that, well, if I want to be good, I need to follow the rules as closely as I can. And so I had a tension where I would hear or gay people are an abomination, and everything's I mean screaming, no, 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 oh, my friend's gay. He's like one of the most faithful people I know. And I was so religious and so faithful. I thought I was receiving a call to the ministry myself. And my friend who had bought into this worldview gently let me know, no, 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 that's not God. Women are not to be ministers. And so I think things started to fall apart a little bit there for me. But then in college, when I began a religion degree and actually read the Bible in historical context and jumped into documentary hypothesis and learned Greek, the idea of taking one single English translation of the Bible
Mhm.
seemed absurd. And then my faith collapsed. Um, and I think it was really difficult for me. This was in the early aughts. I didn't know anyone else who had loved faith as much as I had who lost it. And so I felt profoundly alone. And I think I see echoes of that now in all of these deconstruction communities online. Um, but I guess I was the trendsetter. Um, but it was very, very difficult. But I kept the curiosity about how people interact with their faith and how that motivates them. And that's how I ended up here, I guess.
Where are you at now? I don't mean to put you on the spot. I always, when people ask me what do you believe now, quote unquote, I always say, well, everything is a snapshot of this hour, this moment, this day, because it's a journey. So I
Yeah.
don't mean to say, oh, whatever you're saying now is where you're going to be forever. But I think things get very focused on personal belief in a weird way when you have children and grandchildren, which I do, because it's always this big question of, what shall I pass on that I knew? They're starting at a different place. I rejected this. These questions come up. You have kids. You're
Mm.
living in a part of the country where I guess people go to church, and you're not part of that cohort that
Some.
completely walked away. So I just go sort of curious, time out for a minute of just kind of where you're at.
Mhm. So I called myself an atheist for years, which was a fun experience living in the Midwest. That was confusing to some people. Um, but I think it's very strange to say this, but by spending all this time with people of faith and a lot of people who left their faith, and even being in very religious environments where awful things are happening, I can't call myself an atheist anymore. I think I'm just your standard agnostic. There are days where I think there could be something. It would be nice if there's something. I see elements of strength in people that are hard to explain the origin of, but then at the same time, I also have days where I see what I see in the world and that's all I think there might be. I will say, and this is, I don't know, this feels controversial. It's my kind of progressive bent on the world, but I definitely now have a understanding that evil exists in this world that I did not have back when I was an idealistic religious kid. I've just seen the torment that other people have put others through and there's no other word for it. Now, whether that has a metaphysical origin, I don't know. But there's a lot of darkness in this world, and I think the only curative for it is the audacity of people who reside in the truth and insist upon it. And I'm just very lucky to spend some time with folks like that.
Yeah, we interviewed someone called Catherine Pakaluk, who's written a book called Hannah's Children, which is interesting because she's a Roman Catholic who's a university professor. She has 8 children, and she's nothing to do with any of the movements you're doing. She
Mm.
interviewed 50 women, all of which have had 5 kids or more.
Huh.
Almost none fit into the cohort that you interviewed. These are not people who come out of the many children evangelical church. Some are Jewish, some are Catholic, some are agnostic
Mm.
and atheist, but they've just decided to go in a very different direction when it comes to fertility. Most
Mm.
of the women she interviewed are highly educated. It's a big world out there. Not everybody is, out of one background. But what was interesting about Catherine, and the reason I bring her up, is that she says that the reason she returned to the Catholic Church was after she visited Auschwitz. She said there has to be a reckoning somewhere. Something in her wanted justice. I don't know. It's an interesting point, don't you think?
Oh, it absolutely is. And I wish, I mean, the Southern Baptist Convention keeps doing exactly what Krista Brown says it will. Yeah, there's a part of everyone, there's a part of a lot of survivors who, not that they want Krista to be wrong, but they want to see justice here in this world. So many of them suffer daily with the consequences of what they went through, and then really the turmoil from coming out about it. I definitely understand that motivation. I will say also, I recently went on a trip abroad with my family, and as you do in Europe, we went into a lot of cathedrals and churches. And I there's a stillness that's so different from a mega church, or a place with big flashy screens and smoke. And I enjoyed the stillness there. But when I asked my son what he thought about it, he just sort of shrugged, the architecture's cool. So I don't know if that's me looking for something or what that was.
You know, one of the people you talk about in your book very warmly, I'm just sort of interested in your take on her, is Rachel Held Evans. And the Washington Post, as you quoted them, said she was the most polarizing woman in evangelicalism. I know Rachel have for a long time, and then she wrote her A Year of Biblical Womanhood. But I have a question for you because you're a journalist and you've observed so much and you've been interviewing these women and you write things. You know, I am slightly allergic to I don't know how to put this, to progressive Christianity in all its forms, because I think that it dresses something up. And I'll give you an example, not related to a person, but just an argument. You know, it's the kind of thing where you have a woman or a man writing a book saying, when the Apostle Paul comes off as a misogynist and says you should shut up if you're a woman and be quiet in church, what he really meant was, and then you fill in the blank. And I'm at a place in my life when I look at these texts and I say, no, he meant exactly what he said. He was a misogynist twerp who knows nothing. And I refuse to be lulled into this idea that somehow there's a progressive interpretation of this level of misogyny, or there's a good way to look at certain aspects. You get into it a little bit because in your book you talk about the gospels that were not included in the canon, which formed over a 200 to 300 year period, and then the book of Revelation nearly got left out and was put in late, and so forth and so on. Some of which you go into, some of which you don't. But I just wonder what your view is, because I really think that part of the problem is that we have this window dressing of niceness when it comes to religion, and we cut it some slack, and progressive people do all the time with Islam, for instance. You know, I don't understand why we think it's somehow we can't talk about the fact that women are raped in prisons every day in Iran for not wearing a head covering. And we tend to worry more about what the Israelis are doing in the Palestinian conflict. I think there's an inequality there where liberal progressive Christians pick and choose, and they just weirdly always seem to come down on the same side as other progressive liberal voices. There's a herd mentality on the left, which is not as wicked as the herd mentality that covers up the abuse of women on the right. Don't get me wrong, there's no moral equivalence here. But I'm just saying, you're an observer. I come away from the book respecting your intelligence incredibly and your writing ability, and you're out there looking around. Where is all this going in terms of Christianity in general, progressive Christianity and so forth? I don't think there's that much there to be salvaged by nice authors like Rachel Held, and all the others. I think I look at all this and I just say, no, you can pick science or you can pick this, but you can't have both. And you can't play nice with oppressive religions. And I don't care if it's brown people and we're only allowed to criticize white people. I'm kind of done with the whole package, from Hindu nationalism to the South royal family. I have a different framework, and mine is really simple. And that is, if you want to judge, I only ask one question: how do they treat women? And everything else follows from that. And so when you look at cultures and religious traditions that don't treat women well, I don't give a shit if they're 2,000 years old or 6,000, or that's your culture, or these are our customs. To hell with it. Either we're going to turn the page or we're not. And I don't know, where you're at on that, but I don't think progressive Christians have done a very good job, because they let people off the hook that they don't want to seem like they're Islamophobic or anti-religious or anti-Catholic. So we're always sort of, it's easy to criticize Bill Gothard. How about the Saudi royal family? How about all the women who can't go to school in Afghanistan, where, by the way, my Marine son fought for 2 years?
Mhm.
I have a pretty tough view of this. I don't know where you're at.
Yeah. So I there's part of me that kind of feels like anyone who's trying to make sense of the world in a religious way is going to be doing an interpretive task. Either you're taking, no, even the people who claim they're taking every word of the Bible literally, they're not. They're picking and choosing. So what you're spotting is that same activity skewed through a different lens. Um, in college, I got very interested in analytical philosophy, and people who really argued for like a logical worldview. And if you cannot describe it very discreetly, concretely, scientifically, don't talk about it in philosophy. And it really disturbed me because I felt like there are other types of truth out there. And there's a more pragmatic truth that we tell through stories.
Hmm.
Now, I think what you're pointing to is people are picking and choosing, they're telling themselves a story. They're telling themselves a story where they get to be the hero, whether you're conservative or progressive. If you've inserted yourself into a story for God's ends, you're the hero. And so your interpretation is the true and actual one. And that's going to require you to scrape away the bits that you no longer believe in.
Hmm.
I have a lot of tension. I, for years, broke out in hives if I entered a church. But at the same time, I do have a respect for people wherever they are on the political spectrum, if they can adopt a story that causes no harm, that does not exploit other people, and that can motivate them to move forward in life. I was in Texas reporting for this book, and I mean, it was a day after day, hours and hours and hours of interview. And I interviewed, sorry, I visited my aunt, who's probably in her 80s now, and runs a Catholic worker home for
Hmm.
recent immigrants. And they have a chapel, and I was a raised Catholic. I don't know anything of, I'm not intimately connected to Catholicism. And my cousin, who's a little younger than me, while we were there, she showed me the chapel. She walked in, she dipped her knees as she came in. And there's like this gentleness in that respect for all of the things her faith means to her that motivates her to get up every day and feed other people.
Hmm.
That was powerful. So I can see some of the value in a progressive faith. But if you're sidelining other people, then no, it's doing the same thing as any other faith,
Yeah.
just via harm on
Yeah.
the of it.
So we have been talking with Sarah Stankorb, and she has written a wonderful book that I think was a national bestseller.
Yeah,
And yeah, which, congratulations, by the way, on that. That's tough to do. So
thanks.
whoever's looking at your new book proposal, snap it up. Um,
I'm gonna freeze frame that. That's fine.
yeah,
Thank you.
yeah, and basically she's written this book on the powerful forces within evangelicalism and other and religion that have abused women, called Disobedient Women: How a Small Group of Faithful Women Exposed Abuse Brought Down the Powerful Pastors and Ignited an Evangelical Reckoning. The only thing I would say is, first of all, we're going to include this as a book club offering in our It Has to Be Read book club. And Disobedient Women is our pick for September. And we want to have Sarah back for a panel with Baptist Land author Krista Brown and a well-trained wife, Tia Levings. By the way, that book's coming out in August, and we've already interviewed Tia. And it reads like a part two to your book, because it's told all in the first person of what happened to her. It's a very powerful book. And I'd
Yeah,
like to
I've
get,
read it.
yeah. And Tia right now happens to be reading and giving notes on a book I'm writing that I sent to her to said, please, Tia, give me some notes because I quote you so much in mine. And by the
Mm.
way, I've got some quotes from your book in my new book as well, which I'm not going to talk about because I'm not pitching anything and it's a long way down the road, but I'm using your work.
Thank you.
Yes. And I feel very connected to you because I'm reading your book and I'm quoting it and so forth and so on. So we'd like to have you back. I hope that's good with you. Would you come back?
Yes, absolutely.
Good. And really, it's a pleasure and an honor to talk to you. You did an incredible piece of work with this book.
Thank you. It's a joy to speak to you. And thank you for telling me about Mary Pride
Yes.
and be her
Yeah.
agent.
That's a nutty story, but there you are. And she doesn't like black lace nightgowns and said that my mother should not have included that in a book on marriage, that lingerie is any part of it because it's all about having babies. So that's Mary
Wow.
Pride in a nutshell. So pick which line you'd want to be in, lingerie with my mom or 9 kids, Mary Pride.
I sure hope that's a false dichotomy.
Hey, it's one or the other.
That's amazing.
Anyway, this is a real pleasure, Sarah. And listen, please do what Krista did for us. Don't go away right now. Talk to Ernie, my producer, after I leave. If you have ideas on other people we ought to be interviewing, whether they're known or unknown, have a book or don't have a
Sure.
book, but have something to say, that's how
Yeah.
we get a lot of our guests because we
Okay.
trust the people. I know you know people. Please tell us who
Yeah.
else we should talk to. And
Absolutely.
thank you so much. This is a real pleasure. It's been lovely being with you. Thank you for being with us.
Yeah, thank you. I really am thrilled to meet you. So this
Same
is
here.
exciting.
Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Okay. All right.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.